6:30, so we are going to start our session on Edmund Burke. And I am the host for this session, and I would like to welcome you all to the session, Edmund Burke on Confronting Authoritarianism, the Spirit and the Letter, in association with the Burke Society of America and the Russell Kirk Center. Allow me to start this session with some brief remarks. Burke was a remarkable man because he was a remarkable thinker. One cannot confine his merits to this rhetoric and sum up his accomplishments as literary while putting aside the substance of his thought. His words do not ring hollow. His flights of imagination are not empty abstractions. His marvelous literary skills requires taking his thought seriously as political philosophy. With Burke, the inflation of daily occurrences are put in a trend and seen as effects. Burke's attempt to invest the mundane with significance seems to make it lose its character as mundane. Absorbed as he was, Burke looked at public issues with almost matchless penetration, hence the authority of his words and of his thought. And without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Miguel Magado, who will be our chairman for this session on Edmund Burke. Thank you very much. Miguel.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Well, welcome you all to our panel on Burke. We have a wonderful panel with us. This panel will be exclusively devoted to Burke's thinking and action, political action. And let me start by presenting our first speaker, Professor Jan Krauw. First of all, Professor, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a great honor to have him. He's a great expert and has a very impressive list of published work on Edmund Burke. He's a professor of history at Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. He's also the director of the Edmund Burke Society of America and a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. And I realized by our previous talk over there that you also are the director of the Thomas More Society?
Thomas More Scholarship Program.
Oh, very well. That's well, we couldn't be in better hands. Please, Professor Jan Krauw, you have 12 minutes, by the way. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I wanted first to express the deep gratitude of the Edmund Burke Society to the IEP and the director, Professor Spada, for this invitation, a third invitation to come and try to nudge Edmund Burke into the wider theme of the conference, which from the experience of the last day and a half has provided such rich ideas and thoughts. My paper is called Scraping the Barrel, Burke, Rousseau and the Roots of Authoritarianism. In 1791, Edmund Burke wrote of the revolution in manners and morality that he detected shaping events in revolutionary France. I am certain that the writings of Rousseau led directly to this kind of shameful evil. Burke's assessment of Rousseau's influence on the French Revolution has inevitably come under critical scrutiny from historians, as have more recent attempts to connect that assessment prophetically and instructively to the emergence of the totalitarian state in the 20th century. In this paper, I shall try to modify and update this perspective and ask whether Burke's analysis of Rousseau as a man and of Rousseau's elevation of the goodness of natural man above the morally corrupting influence of civilization may help us understand the related concept of modern political authoritarianism, arguably a more virulent and insidious threat to Western liberal democracy in our present century. Burke's critique of Rousseau appears at its sharpest in his letter to a member of the National Assembly published in May 1791, 2 years after the outbreak of the revolution. In this work, Burke presents to us a philosopher of some undoubted genius, venerated by members of the legislative, but a peddler in paradoxes, whose character is defined by vanity and shamelessness. In short and memorably, a, quote, insane Socrates of the National Assembly. That reference, an insane Socrates, is intended to remind us of Plato's description of Diogenes the cynic as a Socrates gone mad. Diogenes, we may recall, challenged Plato with a philosophy based upon the alliance of reason and nature rather than metaphysics. Table and cup I see, he remarked to Plato on one occasion, but your tablehood and cuphood I cannot see. In undermining the authority both of metaphysics and of convention, Diogenes' particular marriage of reason and primal nature expressed itself in those outrageous statements and public spectacles that drew upon him ridicule, pity, and admiration. On one level, Rousseau, ridiculous, pitiable, and admirable, fits easily into the cynic's barrel. And while the unexamined life may indeed not be worth living, anyone who has perused Jean-Jacques' Confessions will appreciate that to examine it in excess, however brilliantly, is to risk wallowing in paradox and madness. Rousseau's insanity, as Burke saw it, arose from the paradoxical morality that he employed to sever and then to reconstruct the relationship between human freedom and social virtue, perhaps liberty and duty, one might say. Such a project, Burke remarks in the letter, engenders principles that are so inapplicable to real life and manners that we British never dream of drawing from them any rule for laws or conduct, or for fortifying or illustrating anything by a reference to his opinions. They have with us the fate of older paradoxes." End of quote. There follows a quotation from Horace extolling the vital relationship of mus maiorum to justice, fully in the spirit of that firm opponent of cynicism, Cicero. Is there, though, anything more than a passing allusion in this parallel between two insane Socrateses? Something in that reference to older paradoxes, perhaps, that might explain how a political revolution for liberty mutated into an authoritarian nightmare under the Jacobin. I think an answer may be found in an entry in Burke's private notebook titled "Several Scattered Hints Concerning Philosophy and Learning Collected Here from My Papers." It was composed in the 1750s before Burke entered politics and never published during his lifetime. Clear themes of continuity give these scattered hints an overall coherence. Burke esteems learning and curiosity, but praises a broad education above narrow specialism, since, quote, "the end of learning is not knowledge but virtue," unquote. He recommends a moderate skepticism, again quoting him, "Doubts and uncertainties affect our understandings as fermentation affects liquors. It disturbs them for a while, but it makes them both the sounder and clearer ever after." In short, the hints are thoroughly Ciceronian. Reason respects custom, which is a more sure guide than our theories, and advances hand in hand with humility and curiosity. Virtue is realized in action, and action proceeds by probability, not certitude. And amid such reflections, Burke inserts the following anecdote about Diogenes the cynic. When Diogenes was dying, his friends desired to know how he would have his body disposed of. "Throw it into the fields," says he. They objected that it might be liable to be devoured by wild beasts. Then set my staff by me to drive them off. One answered, but you will then be insensible, unable to do that. So shall I be, says Diogenes, of their injuries. Burke's response to the story is to admire the vivacity of the turn and then to declare the philosophy behind it showy, but having no substance, since turning it into a general principle would result in obvious ill consequences. Lots of dead bodies lying around the place. Decomposing is not good for society. Then, expanding upon the theme, Burke turns to the subject of funeral ceremonies, arguing that such rituals, quote, throw a decent veil over the weak and dishonourable circumstances of our nature. What shall we say to that philosophy, he asks, that would strip our nature naked? Well, we might ask, why not call it a philosophy of vanity, since it elevates the authority of the individual's reason above the social customs, the mos maiorum, that are in fact essential for its operation. We might also consider it a source of paradoxical morality, for Burke goes on to show how the shamelessness released when right reason acts upon the instincts of nature stripped naked produces a new sense of shame when that same reason meets its actual limitations in trying to master or comprehend those instincts. Some unnamed authors, Burke comments, having reduced love and the social rituals of courtship to, quote, mere procreation, then talk of the generation of mankind as getting rid of excrement, who lament bitterly their being subject to such a weakness. In the letter over 30 years later, Burke was to refer to Rousseau strikingly as a father who, quote, casts away as a sort of offal and excrement the spawn of his disgustful amours. Put some of his children into a founding hospital. The social and political consequences of embracing a philosophy of vanity in society then, with its attendant paradoxical morality, was not, in Burke's mind, so much the liberation of natural man from the oppressive structures of shame, as the emergence of a new kind of shaming, designed this time not to cover the natural weaknesses of our nature, but to deny the limitations of an instrumental reason working upon an elemental human nature. It is in the denial or defiance of the paradox that the insanity resides. And this is a point Burke clarifies in the next paragraph of those scattered hints by noting the logical distinction between a contradiction and a contrariety. Here's, quote, Burke's words. No man in his senses can agree to a contradiction. And then he counters, again reflecting the debt to Cicero, that a truly symbiotic marriage of reason and nature can be achieved only by factoring mystery and probability into our rational calculations above abstract theory and certitude. In a word, by embracing contrariety. For, again in Burke's words, an apparent, nay, a real contrariety in things may not only be proposed and believed, but proved beyond any reasonable doubt. Burke rounds out this gathering of thoughts with a powerful rhetorical question that I suggest could have served as an antidote to authoritarianism avant la lettre. Why should I desire to be more than a man? I have too much reverence for our nature to wish myself divested even of the weak parts of it. I see Burke here settling early in his career on the conviction that any system claiming to harmonize liberty and justice through human reason and natural instinct was doomed unless it embraced also the inescapable mystery of that harmony as mediated through custom and convention. That position rests upon the principle that human nature contains an essential transcendent dimension that prevents its own full disclosure to our reason, even right reason, and even when that nature is supposedly stripped naked for the purpose. If we apply that insight to the Rousseauian influences that Burke thought he saw working upon the French Revolution, we may deduce that authoritarianism feeds upon the weakening perception of that transcendent dimension. This weakening is itself a mark of pride or vanity, by which shamelessness becomes a liberating sign of virtue. And then any effort to recover the authority of the transcendent by an appeal to our social nature through custom or convention becomes itself shameful, and its proclamation a vice that is literally seen as inhumane. Frustrated by the paradoxical claims of a liberating reason and the obstinate ultimate unfathomability of our primal nature, we, the people, in other words, become complicit in a state-sponsored authoritarianism, artfully designed to hide the contradiction that lies behind our own vain aspirations. And then, as Diogenes is also reputed to have taught, for the conduct of life we need right reason or a halter.
Professor Jan Crow, thank you very much. It was a wonderful paper. I just got this doubt. I'll take advantage of my prerogative as the chair of this panel to share with you something that occurred to me while I was listening to your paper. If reason is too fragile to free itself from human nature taken as a whole, then it should be also too fragile to emancipate itself from individual character. If that is true, I don't know if it's true or not, but if it's true, then Rousseau's theories would be bad because his inner character was bad. Does that make sense? I'll just leave that question to you. I'll get back to you after everyone else has given their presentations. But now it's time to give the floor to Professor Yvonne Moreira. Yvonne Moreira, she's a dear friend and colleague here at the Institute of Political Studies for many, many years. And she's also a great scholar on Burke. She's the Portuguese editor of Burke's Reflections on Revolution in France. And there can be no bigger compliment than this. Also, she is my borrowed aunt for many years. Okay, so I'll give you the floor, Professor Yvonne Moreira.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My first remarks are to thank Professor Spada for the invitation, and now thank you all for being here. I see many of my students. Thank you so much. It would be utterly unfair not to think of Burke as a parliamentarian who fought against authoritarianism. In fact, although Burke was accused of criticizing the rights of man, namely in the aftermath of his diatribe against the French Revolution, his entire parliamentary life and the great causes in which he was involved were fights for the rights of the most disadvantaged and against various types of authoritarianism. This is so in his defense of Catholics' rights in his native Ireland, in his defense of the right of American colonists not to be taxed without being represented, in his impeachment of the first Governor-General of Bengal, whom he accuses of exercising arbitrary power and tyranny towards the Indian people, and also in his fight against slavery, through the elaboration of the sketch of a Negro Code, the British version of the Code Noir. Burke's statement on Warren Hastings' impeachment are, in a way, an illustration of the meaning of his entire political career. I quote, "He cannot have absolute power by succession, he cannot have it by compact, for the people cannot covenant themselves out of their duty to their rights. If any, by conquest, by compact, or by succession, exercise power which for the good of mankind ought never to exist, those who gave that power and those who receive it are alike criminal. And there is no man that is not bound to resist it, and who ought not to do so. Nothing but the fear of greater mischief and the apprehension of absolute destruction can justify man in the usurpation of or endurance of it." Resist authoritarianism is not something that one could choose not to do. In fact, the above quotation clearly states that consent to an authoritarian government and administering it are equally criminal, and that both the ruler and the people governed in such a way are required to ratify their ways, because both are disrespectful of human dignity. Burke's entire political career can be summed up in this duty to find authoritarianism. In view of his effort to correct disrespect for people's rights in Ireland, America, or India, one might think that Burke was a critic of the British Empire. In fact, it is quite the opposite. He so valued the principles of liberty present in British institutions and principles of governance that he believed that being a subject of the King of England was a privilege, on condition, however, that the king did not forget that he should rule the empire according to English principles, albeit respecting the liberties and the idiosyncrasies of the people he administered. That he should rule in the spirit of English liberties and not by the letter of the law that proclaimed his abstract right of governing and taxing as a ruling power. In fact, it is this same appeal to rule in the spirit of English liberties and not by the letter of the law which leads Burke to appeal to moderation when discussing the situation of Catholics in Ireland with Sir Hercule Langrich. Burke rightly observes that the Irish were in the position of belonging to a state while not being citizens of that state. But while he does not approve of Ireland being ruled in this way, he does not encourage challenging the government in this particular case, because he feels that the situation of Ireland would be much worse if it ceases to be under English administration. In fact, when one thinks of the state as supreme government, not everyone belongs to the governing elite, and this is even its most common form and an acceptable mode of government when it is kept within limits that respect the rights of the ruled. In the dispute between England and the American colonists, Burke's initial struggle was aimed at getting the Crown to recover its primitive and fruitful relationship with the colonies, rejecting its abstract right to tax America. The colonists' refusal of being taxed without being represented was based on principles of liberty that they had learned from England. He felt that binding the peoples of America to the enjoyment of their rights under the protection of the British Crown was a mild tie that would prove as strong as iron chains and could guarantee the continuity of the British Empire. For the colonists to claim freedom was to claim a fundamental right. Thus, if England endorsed the defense of the rights of colonists, this prudent measure would in the end justify British presence in America. The upholding of the same freedoms the English enjoyed in the motherland freedoms inherited from Magna Carta, in the colonies would strengthen the ties between England and the colonies based on similar privilege and equal protection. The difference between keeping the colony or losing it was played in choosing the abstract right to tax the colonies, which tax, however small, was an expression of the arrogance of the state, or opting instead for the governance that had been practiced until then and which had been advantageous for both parties. George III was choosing a speculative right whose theoretical perfection was linked to a practical fragility. It was literally a right, but in spirit, an abuse. The right not to be taxed without being represented, which the English people enjoyed in their motherland and which should be extended to all the subjects throughout empire, was ratified by prescription, and historical realization on its side was endowed with practical perfection, and for those reasons was preferable to the context of a prudent political exercise. By taking sides for the defense of human rights in a concrete and delimited way, Burke follows the ancestral practice of the British tradition. In fact, in his confrontation with authoritarianism, in all the struggles in which he was involved, Burke recovered for the 18th century a much older tradition of civil rights, which had been reformulated and sustained in a different way by the radical Commonwealth men in 17th century England. In fact, in the 17th century, England had lived through a period where the claim for rights had been made in a different way from that upheld by Magna Carta, namely through the invocation of the abstract principles of the political contract. In the years going from 1646 to 1649, the Clark manuscripts, edited by Woodhouse, compile a series of interventions by the Puritans presenting the leveler principles they defended. 3 decades later, in response to Filmer's Patriarch, Algernon Sidney wrote Discourses Concerning Government, where he demanded for the community the same rights that Price will later request in his famous Discourse on the Love of Our Country, which was the leitmotif for Burke's reflections. Burke reputs to Price's discourses in his reflections. Later, in his appeal, he again rejects the revival of Republican ideas presented by Thomas Paine in Rights of Man. Although anxious to repeal 17th century radical ideas of republicanism and rights, Burke is nevertheless as concerned with the independence of Parliament as those radicals were. To Burke, the stress is to be put on civil rights and their historical defense by prescription. In Burke, we see the recovery and the appreciation of the prudential dimension of governance and the enjoyment of rights. Looking at Magna Carta, it is easy to understand how Burke could support concrete rights while vigorously fighting the so-called abstract rights upheld by French revolutionaries. The rights supported by Magna Carta are civil rights, possible and protected within society, practiced and consolidated by prescription. According to William Sharp McKinney, these rights were concrete remedies for concrete ills and aimed at restoring the degraded dignity of the subjects. First of all, they restored the dignity of the protesting nobility, but they also benefited the people. The rights claimed by the barons in Runnymede were aimed at correcting concrete wrongs, and their scope at the time was perfectly practical. These are precisely the kinds of rights that Burke repeatedly upheld. Thus, in his reflections, he states that the claim and consecration of the rights of the English people was not made in their most important documents in the name of abstract rights. I quote. It's a long quote, but it is very enlightening about what he thought about the subject. In the famous law called the Petition of Right, the Parliament says to the king, "Your subjects have inherited this freedom, claiming their franchises not on abstract principles as the rights of man, but as the rights of Englishmen, and as a patrimony derived from their forefathers." Selden and the other profoundly learned men who drew this petition of right were as well acquainted, at least, with all the general theories concerning the rights of man. But for reasons worthy of that practical wisdom which superseded their theoretic science, they preferred this positive, recorded, hereditary title to all which can be dear to the man and the citizen, to the vague, speculative right which exposed their sure inheritance to be scrambled for and torn to pieces by every wild, litigious spirit. End of quote. To Burke, the virtue of political action and the most effective way to oppose authoritarianism is to opt for practical wisdom and to oppose abstract claims of right, and to oppose abstract claims of rights. The English Constitution, not conceived by intellectual design but grown from usages and customs, was the guardian of this order. Burke didn't think that in certain historical circumstances, society could ignore the right of life, liberty, or property. But his writings and the battles he fought make it clear that he thought the best way to uphold these rights is not by simply enunciate them and in their theoretical perfection, but rather by endorsing them on the basis of their historical, practical application, and doing that within a strong and independent parliament. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ivone Moreira. Wonderful paper. Just a quick provocation. So you told us that Burke was an enemy of authoritarianism. You described his career as an enemy of authoritarianism, but also as an enemy of ideas, of radical ideas of freedom. So what is the difference between rights as he stood for them and these rights as founded by ideas of radical freedom? You told us that it was based on prescription.
Yes,
historical prescription.
He himself has the answer to the question by saying that the perfection, the intellectual perfection of the rights of man is the practical imperfection, and that by claiming the right to an abstract right to liberty, for instance, they may even destroy the conditions in which liberty is possible. So
sure, but my point was this. What makes the difference between the legitimacy of a certain source of right and another source of right is prescription.
yes.
Prescription is another word for the authority of tradition. So he was not such an enemy of authority, right?
But
only of
authoritarianism. Yes.
So we would have to discuss what is the difference between authority and authoritarianism. All right.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. So now it's time to present also my friends and my colleague at the Institute of Political Studies, Professor João Vacas. He has been a student at the Institute, but he has a degree in law. He's also a lawyer. Unfortunately, he works for the wrong law office, but that's a different matter. And he's a great authority on subjects related to European law. But today he's here as a scholar of Burke in his own right. So please, João, the floor is yours. 12 minutes, don't forget.
Thank you, Miguel. I'll try to be brief, if I can. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Espada for the invitation also, and I would like to greet my friends and the panel. Well, in April 1963, Raymond Aron gave 3 lectures at the invitation of the University of California and of the Jefferson Lectures Committee, which became known by the unique title Essai sur les libertés. At the time, Arnaud made clear that he would like to show appreciation for the invitation he had received by speaking of Jefferson himself, but ended up acknowledging that what he knew of him was, quote, not superior to that of a European who had long since discovered America, but who has devoted himself neither to the political, neither to the intellectual history of the United States. And so he quickly shifted his attention to Tocqueville. In the presence of such distinguished specialists on Edmund Burke, I confess I was tempted to choose the same erroneous strategy and speak primarily about the thinker who has been my subject of study for many years now, Roger Scruton. However, I quickly realized I could not use Raymond Aron's elegant subterfuge for two main reasons. First and foremost, I am not Raymond Aron. And second, there is sufficient communication between Burkean and Scrutonian thought and action to prevent me from claiming unfamiliarity with the work of the man that, according to Roger Scruton himself, rescued him from Marxism, Foucault, and the influences of May '68, both in Paris and lying at the heart of the left establishment that governed British scholarship, and confirmed conservatism could be acquired by a process of rational inquiry or serious thought, rather than just being inheritable in, quote, the way you might inherit a speech impediment, unquote. Burke's elucidation of the possibility of becoming a conservative following an intellectual path does not diminish the importance of the concept of inheritance for either him or Scruton, namely when applied to liberty. To the latter, the greatest epochs of human endeavor have been periods of inheritance, in which people have tried not just to live for the future, but also to live up to the past, unquote. For the former, notwithstanding its potential universality, liberty was in fact an inherited right that required clarification due to its indefinition. The indefiniteness had been boosted by the disruptive effect of the French Revolution, which brought with it new interpretations of the concept and exponentiated doubts about its nature and limits. France's aggressive turmoil amply justified Edmund Burke's caution and desire for precision. For him, what was being announced or proclaimed there under the name of liberty hardly deserved it. Scruton bluntly called the revolution man's second disobedience, denouncing the effect of the revolutionary proclamation of a purely abstract liberty as the destruction of the qualified and partial liberties which come through the work of compromise. Burke's work clarifies his position and decants from the possible meanings of the word, the one that best respects the human inheritance. Quote, the only liberty I mean is a liberty connected with order, that not only exists along with order and virtue, but which cannot exist at all without them. Roger Scruton summed up his view in a way that would most likely please Burke. We conservatives value our freedom not because it is an abstract possession of the abstract individual, but because it is a concrete and historical achievement, the result of civil discipline over centuries, and the sign of our undemonstrative respect for the law of the land. Anticipating what he would later call culture of repudiation and oikophobia, Scruton emphasized the introduction by the French Revolution of, quote, a kind of incurable nihilism into the social order, to infect all public processes with the sense that they are without justification and to be understood merely as the passing drift of power, unquote. A large part of Burke's writings contain a comparison of the virtue and benefits of the British consensual model with the multiple and serious shortcomings of the adventurous French project, based on the perfectionist and abstract proclamation of generic rights at the expense of the concrete personal ones. Scruton attributes some of these same flaws to the European integration project. But Burke's affirmation of British virtues was not limited to parallelism with what was then experienced on the other side of the English Channel. Even before 1789, he felt obliged to remind the British of their balanced, moderate, and prudent political model, namely when the king and his government sought to subjugate the peoples of the American colonies by force. The title of our session is marked by the apparent counterposition between letter and spirit as means of confronting authoritarianism, but verba volant, scripta manent. It is not possible to know Edmund Burke, his political action, and his polysemic understanding of what liberty and spirit were, for instance, except through the printed word. His oratorical skills, so often praised, come to us only through what has been written down. Luckily, that is not the case with Roger Scruton, that can still be seen and heard in multiple platforms. However, as far as authoritarianism is concerned, Burke's hierarchy between letter and spirit is clear. the second should take precedence over the first. He notably said, a British governor ought to govern on British principles, not by British forms. God forbid. For if ever there was a case in which the letter kills and the spirit gives life, it would be an attempt to introduce British forms and the substance of despotic principles together into any country, unquote. Burke's well-reasoned Catilinarian orations against Warren Hastings, arbitrary power, violence, rapacity, and double standards in India are clear testimonies of his respect for local laws, customs, prejudices, and usages in detriment of literality or authoritarianism. He summarized this point of view quite eloquently by claiming that law and arbitrary power are in eternal enmity. Concluding his reflections, Burke says, speaking about himself, that almost the whole of his public exertion has been a struggle for the liberty of others, from one in whose breast no anger durable or vehement has ever been kindled, but by what he considered as tyranny, unquote. In his foreword to Russell Kirk's Edmund Burke, A Genius Reconsidered, Roger Scruton described Burke's life in the same tone, as a life of action, but it was an action which both sprang from thought and engendered thought. Perhaps no politician has ever speculated so deeply about the nature and limits of the human psyche as Burke. And these speculations are at every point put to practical use in order to warn against the crazy desire to overthrow the laws and institutions on which our civilization has been erected, unquote. Scruton's perspective is confirmed by Burke himself, to whom it is the business of the speculative philosopher to mark the proper ends of government. It is the business of the politician, who is the philosopher in action, to find out proper means towards those ends and to employ them with effect. One might say that Edmund Burke was true to this point of view and lived according to it, in both the speculative and the political dimensions, and so did Roger Scruton. They talked the talk and walked the walk, and because of this, suffered accusation and abandonment by the parties they helped to strengthen through thought, word, and deed. Echoing Burke's stylistic model and method, Roger Scruton's tribute to Kenneth Minogue states that he was not in the business of destroying things or angering people. He was in the business of defending old-fashioned civility against ideological rage. And he believed this was the real meaning of the freedom that English-speaking peoples have created and enjoyed. In defense of civility, he could be provocative, but it was characteristic of the Britain in which he lived, whose institutions he defended in so heartfelt a way that his civility was regarded by the left as a kind of aggression. Having known Roger Scruton and his work, it is impossible not to consider that his assessments of Burke and Minogue apply fully and fairly to himself. He was also not a mere academic, as Edmund Burke was no mere politician. There was nothing ordinary about any of them or in their conservative activism. Like Burke, Scruton denounced, quote, the strange superstition that has arisen in the Western world that we can start all over again, remaking human nature, human society, and the possibilities of happiness, as though the knowledge and experience of our ancestors were now entirely irrelevant, unquote. Also like Burke, Roger Scruton was personally engaged in the struggle for liberty against tyranny, whether against communist oppression, risking his life to support Czechoslovakian dissidents when still many Western intellectuals flirted with Marxist ideals and turned a blind eye to the true nature of Marxist-Leninism, or against the ignorance of the uprooted urban majorities who sought to ban practices that are part of the identity of the rural world, or in defense of Western civilization and culture against its detractors, or beauty and architecture on a human scale based on a classical vernacular against the megalomania of what he called starchitects, or in promoting local production, be it in a small apple festival or his neighbor's sausages, and local solutions to market failures or in climate problems. In a recent article, Stephen Hayward claimed that if someone invented a time machine of sorts to transform figures from the past into their modern incarnations, putting Burke in the past portal would produce Roger Scruton at the modern end. I would not be that categorical, not least because Scruton has explicitly defined his own intellectual identity in a multifaceted way, and has disagreed with Burke in some aspects, like the imagery used to refer to social knowledge, or the concept of partnership to describe the bond between the dead, the living, and those to be born. Also, one cannot say of Scruton, as Scruton said about Burke, that his writings changed the course of politics and laid the foundation for a political philosophy which has lasted to our day. Nevertheless, he was the maître à penser of many conservatives around the globe in the last decades. Noel O'Sullivan criticized the Burkean, and one could add the Scrutonian, dream of static condition of organic equilibrium on the grounds that the dynamic nature of history excludes it from the outset, pointing out the error that by advocating liberty within the narrow bounds of a purely political idea of balance, he had left conservatism open to the charge that of presenting nothing more than a defense of aristocratic privilege and political despotism. O'Sullivan's adamant conclusion seems to rest less on what Burke actually wrote and publicly advocated than on his particular interpretation of them. Burke never denied historical dynamism, nor did he advocate political despotism, but that dynamism does not inevitably entail that the organic balance must yield more than is imposed on it by the need for reform. Burke's oft-repeated assertion that the state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation is in complete contradiction with O'Sullivan's interpretation. The very Burkean vision of a true natural aristocracy is distinct from the defense of any kind of feudalism, and even more so of the despotism that O'Sullivan ascribes to him. Perhaps O'Sullivan excesses democratism has prevented him from verifying whether, as Burke would define and predict, the existing of a class such as the natural aristocracy is actually essential to the viability of any nation. In this respect, and I'm sorry for the more egalitarian present in the room, one may feel inclined to agree with Oakeshott, for whom the first act of a democracy state would be to form an aristocracy. Burke's and Scruton's skeptical conservative way of interacting with change and the organic purpose of making institutions that have revealed themselves to be important, relevant, and valuable and attracted affection and attention endure would make no sense if they were voluntarily limited to absolute inflexibility. If that was to be the case, conservatism would be nothing more than a form of social taxidermy, when in reality, the purpose of keeping structures and institutions is not an end in itself. Personal involvement in constant institutional and social revival is not the work of museologists, but of proponents of a certain path to the future, as Miguel said in one of his books. As Roger Scruton would put it, the desire to conserve is compatible with all modes of change, provided that change is also continuity. According to this perspective, Burke's and Scruton's conservatism is not fully understandable without considering the regular and cooperative and often silent action aimed at the continuous social and institutional revival. This conservative activity, which does not claim to be absolutely original, but is fundamentally continuationist, contributes to the deferring the end of what is deemed worth keeping. The particular sustenance and robustness of these objects result from the successive combination of diverse wills and personal adhesions, conferring an additive characteristic to its life, as identified by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Life propagates itself by ceaselessly adding to itself what it successfully acquires, like a memory. One day I asked Sir Roger why he had volunteered to be the organist of his parish if he had such deep metaphysical doubts. And his reply was very straightforward: because I don't want it to end. That seemed to be an excellent summary of his perspective of what it means to be a conservative. Without conservative activity of such a positive nature, institutions would certainly have more ephemeral existences. The conservative perspective cannot be considered as being simply based on the passive, fruitive, or active-reactive poles. Reactive conservatism is not understandable without a positive dimension preceding it, and regular thought and action devoted to preserving institutions are not necessarily less political, even if they are less exuberant in their causes and effects. Concluding, both ordered love for what exists, plus love of order arising from that existence, permeated by the awareness of individual and collective imperfection, frailty, finitude, gratitude, and interdependence, converge as part of the loving essence of conservatism, and together they sustain the positive or reactive actions of those who subscribe to this way of feeling, thinking, and acting, like Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton. Philosophers in action, and not just in reaction, both in letter as in spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, João. Wonderful. I thought it wonderful, this idea of Scruton as the Burke living in the late 20th century. And then you went over the differences between one and the other. So may I just suggest a different way to put the difference between one and the other, which would be something like this. Burke's political philosophy is a philosophy of government in the late 18th century. But this Burke who lived in the late 20th century, called Roger Scruton, it seems to me that his conservatism is not anymore a philosophy of government, but a critique of government, a critique of politics, and a critique of culture. So that makes conservatism a sort of insurrection, right? So quite a little bit strange, but you can come back to this question.
If I may, I reply straight away.
All right, so go ahead, 30 seconds.
No, I think you're right, because Burke saw it coming, but Roger Scruton experienced it installed. That is, the effect of abstract ideas were starting to get its roots on political living at the time of the actual Edmund Burke, and Scruton reacts to 2 centuries of this effect. So it is true that they are different, and it is true that Scruton is not as concerned with the constitutional aspects as Edmund Burke was, even though he talks about it in his books. But one thing they have in common, it's the spiritual dimension of what is at stake. And that is a common line between both of them, that it's quite interesting to see that even though the power of abstract ideas have evolved and have installed themselves in the core of our political institutions and our political ideas, operative ideas, some of them, that both of them try to search and find some spiritual roots, and the culture of repudiation for Scruton is mostly love turned upside down.
Okay, that's a great reply, I think. Well, unfortunately, we don't have Professor John Grove with us, but we were able to persuade Carlos Marques de Almeida, my friend Carlos Marques de Almeida, to be his spokesman for today. So let me just introduce very quickly Professor John Grove, even though he's not here, but he's the author of the presentation that Carlos is about to read. And Professor John Grove, he's the managing editor of Law and Liberty, an online magazine on law and politics, published by Liberty Fund. I don't know. I'm one of the subscribers to that online magazine. I get it in my email every morning, and I have good friends writing there, and it's wonderful. And he's also a Burke scholar, and he also wrote an interesting book on John Calhoun. For those non-Americans in the audience, maybe John Calhoun is a esoteric figure, but he was a very important constitutional and political thinker, and also very controversial in the 19th century. So, having said this, let me just give the floor to Carlos, and Carlos is about to read the Professor John Grove's paper.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So, I am reading this paper on behalf of John Grove. Okay? The title of the paper is The Authoritarian Spirit in the Free Country. When considering the question of Burke and authoritarianism, attention will immediately and rightly go to the threat of Jacobin France. But it may also be reasonable to examine how his understanding of what we would call authoritarianism manifested in other circumstances. I turn my attention to Burke's writings on American crisis. Here, to be sure, Burke would hardly say that various British ministers were authoritarian in all full sense of the word. Burke believed is as a free country, one whose government was restrained from any injustice. But his speeches and writing could, I believe, justly be said to warn against a kind of authoritarian spirit which sees all political questions through the lenses of sovereign authority. Just like the colonies on the other side of the Atlantic, Burke was trying to come to grips with the imperial implications of parliamentary sovereignty. Across the ocean, the American colonies were in a unique position, having been established, developed, and governed largely under a pre-1688 paradigm. Their distance from London and the unique circumstances of their governance had shielded them from the constitutional shift of the 18th century and from the ascendant understand that Parliament possessed, in Blackstone's words, a power so transcendent and absolute that it cannot be confined either for causes or persons within any bounds. Beginning with the Stamp Act, imperial policy will set off a chain reaction of theorizing in the colonies regarding the distinction between internal and external taxation, the nature of representation, the independent power of the king, and eventually the locus of colonial loyalty. Burke shared the colonists' instinctive sense of the injustice of the Stamp Act and many of the various attempts at pacification, but they did not agree with many of the theories they developed about conceptual limits of Parliament's legal authority. Rather, he developed an argument that the free government could not be so single-mindedly focused on the origins and justification of legal authority. In a letter to a distant relation in 1777, Burke proclaimed that it was a rage for equality, which had blown up the flames of this present cursed war in America. The equality he had in mind was not exactly the same as the kind he would attack decades later in France. He claimed that the conflict had been inflamed by the insistence of several ministries to force all parts of the British Empire into a Procrustean bed of equal subjection. Parliament insisted that it possessed, by the very nature of sovereignty, an absolute right to govern the colonies in all areas, including domestic taxation. The colonies, on the other hand, claim an absolute inviolable exception at least from internal revenue-raising taxation. The debates over colonial policy inevitably tended to center on questions of abstract rights of sovereignty on the one hand and legal limits to authority on the other. In a pamphlet titled The State of the Nation, to which Burke wrote a reply, William Knox put forward a theory of sovereignty that depended on a completely homogeneous political community in which all portions relate to the sovereign authority in the same way. The sovereign authority, he claimed, which rules the whole empire and is bound to the equal justice to every part, would not admit of any pleas or for exempting the subjects in the colonies from sharing the common burdens and contributing to the necessities of the state. A decade later, Burke will describe this mentality as one of unconditional submission. Burke attacked this imperial vision in the observations on a late state of the nation by appealing to the considerable diversity that makes up the empire. Many establishments, including banks, trading companies, and colonies, he argued, contribute to the well-being of the whole in unique ways, which other establishments are incapable of matching. Speaking of the colonies specifically, Burke noted that they were bound by restrictive trade policies that required that Britain possess a monopoly of their produce and consumption. Given this unique status, it would be wrong to assume that equity demands that they be treated in the same manner as citizens of England. By doing so, Parliament imposed an extreme, rigorous and compulsory equality on the similar elements of society. When speaking of credit and trading institutions, Burke claimed that they stand upon a principle of their own, distinct from, and in some respect contrary to, the relation between prince and subject. It is a new species of contract superimposed upon the old contract of the state. He proceeded to apply the same logic to Ireland and to the American colonies. Our understanding of political authority, I believe, must accommodate a diversity of relationships between state and society, made to fit particular situations. It cannot be understood simply as the lawful power possessed by an institution. Burke's rejection of this false equality has important implications for the very notion of sovereignty as a foundational concept of political justice, especially as it was used by defenders of parliamentary power. When Knox and others appeal to rights of sovereignty to defend the taxation of colonies, they rely on the belief that those rights were the standards of political justice, to justify the use of a given power when it only demonstrates that the power fell within the purview of Parliament's sovereignty. Legal authority was the final word. Rather than serving as a moral standard, however, Burke believed that an appeal to sovereignty could have the opposite effect of an elevating and rigid, legalistic, dare we say, authoritarian standard, a subordinate artificial justice above the prudential assessment of what justice demands in a given situation. Parliament may have theoretically unlimited power, but that fact should usually be ignored. Whether his vision for colonial relations can be reconciled in legal speculation, he argued in the Observations, is a matter of no consequence. It is reconciling policy. Legalistic rigor led to a policy that was incapable of seeing the broad view or of appreciating the American contributions either to the imperial economy or to the French and Indian War. These are rights, he observed in the conciliation speech, which, in their exercise under certain circumstances, are the most odious of all wrongs and the most vexatious of all injustice. So little weight does Burke give to the idea of sovereign power, justified by original consent, that it declares that even had the colonists signed a solemn contract explicitly giving up all claims to liberty upon leaving England, it will have no impact whatsoever on how he would govern them. His skepticism and of alterations to the idea of a social contract somewhat prefigure his famously unique contract described in Reflections, in that both reflect an underlying skepticism about the very use of that metaphor as it implies to political society. Burke suggests that the contract metaphor must be altered to reflect an interconnecting and overlapping web of diverse relationships which makes up the whole of political society. To understand the social contract properly, therefore, one must have an intimate knowledge of circumstances and history, and the perception to see past single legal structure to the more complex political reality below. The idea of the social contract, though, was a simplification meant precisely to obscure such vague and uncertain question of political morality. If the statesman must consider such things, it may be a suggestion that the idea of a contract and the sovereign authority that is created by it is not a sufficient or even particularly useful tool for understanding political right. As the crisis dragged on, Burke seems to have developed a sense that thinking and acting according to these authoritarian terms of sovereignty will not just lead to imprudent policy choices, but to a chance in self-understanding, contending for an imaginary power, he wrote in the letter to the Sheriff of Bristol in 1977, and then he goes a very long quotation, which I read. We begin to acquire the spirit of domination and to lose the relish of honest equality. The principles of our forefathers become suspected to us because we see them animating the present opposition of our children. The faults that grow out of the luxuriance of freedom appear much more shocking to us than the base voices which are generated from the rankness of servitude. Accordingly, the least resistance to power appears more inexcusable in our eyes than the greatest abuses of authority. It is impossible that we should remain long in a situation which breeds such notions and dispositions without some great alterations in the national character." End of quote. Here, Burke seems to describe authoritarian spirit taking root in a free country. By thinking exclusively in the terms of the authorized power, he came to undervalue the bounds of civil society, generosity, and the mutual desire for civil peace. These things having been forgotten, a formal and legal adjustment becomes necessary to reconciliation. And so, in the second conciliation speech of November 16, 1775, he describes the evolution of his views on the legal relationship between Parliament and the colonies. And I quote again. He was convinced that the mere removal of the offensive acts would have given satisfaction to the colonies in former times and for more amicable ends. But now things are on another footing, and in more concessions is required. It is because injudicious coercion has made it necessary. And he had always wished to preserve the legislative power of his kingdom entire in everything, and that it was right, a great grief he saw, that even an odious and scarcely ever to be exercised part of it was to be abandoned. But when the maxims of public councils are not steady, it is necessary that the law should supply the want of prudence. That was thus, for this reason, that limits had been set to absolute power in all countries, and that power, though not absolute, had been preserved, not destroyed, but by such limitations. End of quote. The formal limitation of government power becomes necessary as a result of misguided conduct, which had bred rampant mistrust between ruler and ruled. Power which refuses to be limited by moderation must either be lost or find other more distinct and satisfactory limitations, finally. And so our formal institutionalized limitations on political authority stand not as metaphysical moral limits on legal authority, but as signposts of the crises that have passed and been resolved in a spirit of reconciliation. They represent a kind of inductive learning from past mistakes, and as a reminder to those who possess authority that their position cannot justify their actions, which must always aim to serve genuine justice, amity, and civil concord. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you, Carlos. We have plenty of time for questions, about 20 minutes. So who wants to go first? Por favor. Can I just ask you to say your name? Diga só o seu nome, só para toda a gente saber.
My name is Nuno Wernes. I'm a student of the IEP. So my question is, at a certain point, Burke says, I flatter myself that I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty. And my question is this the kind of liberty that we see today being publicly defended, advocated? And if not, can we see from reading Burke, can we see and think a libertarian challenge apart from the authoritarian challenge?
Okay, thank you. Another question so that we can let up and then go for a round of answers and replies?
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you for the...
Say your name, Rodrigo. Say your name.
Sorry, Rodrigo Leitão, undergraduate students in IEP. Thank you for the magnificent interventions. And most of the panel focused on the authoritarian challenges inside a political community. But looking at the whole conference's program, we see that we seem to be addressing the authoritarian challenges abroad. So in China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, etc. And given the imperium of circumstances which Burke always rules his discourse on, how would we be able to attempt to not create, but perhaps invite or push other political communities to join the liberal community, the liberal democracy club, so to say? Are we merely to befriend a Chinaman and try to talk him into democracy? Or are we to just wait, perhaps, that they come to the realization that perhaps either their system is good as it is because it is their own, or to come to the realization that perhaps they like our model just as much as we do. Thank you.
Obrigado, Rodrigo. Let's go for our panel. Who wants to go first? Professor Ian Crow, do you want to go first?
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. I suppose that's very perceptive and thoughtful questions. They, in a sense, bring us back to character. And I think this was the point that I was hoping would be conveyed, that there's a lot of discussion rightly at the moment about democracy defeating authoritarianism, the hope that this happens, and how would that affect Russia. But I do hope that Edmund Burke continues to cast the light on how is that going to affect the potential victors. Because I think, I don't know whether he had a philosophy of government, I mean, you know, yes, in a sense, but when he spoke about some of the great historical events of his time, he really spoke about them not just, well, in terms of how is this event, how is this conflict, certainly how is it going to affect the vanquished, but also how is it going to affect the conqueror. So we saw that, for example, in America. How would a British victory in America affect the British? We see it here in a slightly different way because, of course, rhetorically, he says, well, we British would never become prey to the ideas, the paradoxical morality of Rousseau. And what he means by that is, I do hope we are aware of the danger. You spoke about, Michael, about you know, the issue of character, and Rousseau. It was Rousseau's character that I think Burke regarded as the great problem. And at some point in the 1760s and 1770s, that was okay. He was an interesting sort of paradoxical writer who could get you to think about, you know, issues that often your gaze would go beyond. And so in that sense, even some of his ideas on education, Burke says earlier, you know, were worth thinking about. The problem is, how does a person such as Rousseau get his ideas implemented within a political system? How does it seep into a philosophy of government? And his answer must be not just the character of Rousseau, which he had damning things to say about. He had no illusions about Rousseau's character, but the problem of our character is our character and is our understanding of our liberties sufficiently robust, sufficiently strong, that we are not ourselves going to become prey to what we think is a peripheral, moral, interesting sort of intellectual gains, but then becomes political reality. And I think this is something that he is really concerned about. And I think it is something we need to be concerned about as well. You know, if democracy, as it were, whatever that embraces, wins over authoritarianism, great. But how has it won? And how has it affected our character? And what have we sacrificed for the sake of a military or a strategic victory? That's not to say we shouldn't do it. It is just to say that we should get clear in our minds how liberty is preserved and protected. And that is where I think we come back to the issue of the paradox that someone like Rousseau and Diogenes offer. It's very attractive to us in some ways. It's the philosophy of vanity. You are the center of the universe. The reason comes from you as an individual. You apply it to your body without necessarily the mediation of those social interactions that basically make reason work. That, I understand, is one of the key features of Roger Scruton's writings, his book on human nature. So anyway, but I've rabbited on too long. But
No, very insightful.
that was
Very insightful. Thank you, Professor. Anyone else?
Well, I just want to say to both questions that in spite Burke as being seen as a critic of philosophy, I managed to write a book on Burke's philosophy. So what I have to propose to those questions is that Burke was not, in spite of being very concerned about circumstances, he was much more concerned about the lines of the principles that guide man. So how could we apply the Burke thinking on resolving present problems? Perhaps we could not do it directly, but we could certainly reflect about the principles that he was concerned about and the principles that inform political reality, and that this would defend or would defend a moderate and rule of law and the moderate power, and that based on his value of tradition is true, but linking this question with the question I have before from my colleague, I would like to say that not all traditions were praised by Burke. He had principles that guide his endorsement of tradition. He says, for instance, he says in this speech on political reform, when he was for a brief time, he had responsibles on government. He said that by that time he said to maintain an institution just for the sake of maintaining that institution when it is a burden and not of service, it's absurd. And he also said that he also criticized the tradition of burning the wives in India. It was a guarantee for the husbands, certainly. So it is understandable that the tradition existed, but it's not a good tradition. What I want to say is that his endorsement of tradition is not an equivalent of endorsing any tradition. It is filtered by his principles, and there is traditions that is worthy to keep and others that are not worthy to keep. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
John, you want to go, or we'll ask some more questions?
I'll answer telegraphically
All
to
right.
Nuno. He's about to leave, but
He left. He just left.
There's a difference between, there's Scruton actually puts it very plainly, the difference between liberty and license. And I think Burke would concur with that difference. There is a way of seeing liberty that goes beyond the framing within institutions. No, I was talking about your question. There's a difference between we know each other for long, so you will. I'll just get back to it. There's a difference between liberty and license, and Roger Scruton subscribed to this difference. And I'm very sure that Burke also, because of his interpretation of what a law should be. on this, I have no doubts that he might fight some of our current liberties a bit awkward, and that normally when they are not accompanied by duties. And for now, I'll.
Okay, more questions from the audience? Please, ladies first, if you don't mind, behind you. Don't worry, I'll give you the word, give you the floor afterwards.
Thank you. My name is Greta Scott. Thank you for talking about Roger Scruton, because I used to know him, and I remember one time he did a speech about freedom of speech, and then proceeded to walk off the stage before we actually got to ask him any questions. So thank you for that. But actually the question I can't resist asking is, what do you think these Conservatives would have said about the state and the current debates around human rights in the UK now, particularly within the Conservative Party? Thank you.
But what do you mean, discussion about human rights in the UK? Can you be more specific?
Yeah, for example, around the trouble that the British government is in with the European Court on Human Rights, but also on the question of whether we should change our Human Rights Act, this kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. Now you, sir, you were waiting? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fan. So I have a question about authoritarianism, because we see that Burke has delivered a very concise and very powerful argument against Rousseau's idea of French Revolution and authoritarianism. But even after that, we see that the pattern of Rousseau-inspired authoritarianism is still prevailing in history. We see the Russian Revolution, and we see the autocratization of countries right now. So is there any, do you think that is there any difficulties in Burke ideas of libertarianism and idea of rule of law, or is it a problem with how we as academics are delivering those lessons to the future generations to prevent the rising of authoritarianism in the future?
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Just to wrap up the question time. No one else? Okay, so who wants to go first? Professor.
Again, some very interesting questions. The one about rights, I suppose in a sense it comes back to the issue of character, doesn't it? I don't know how confident some people would be of the broad character of the Conservative government at the moment to be meddling with the idea of human rights. But at the same time, this abstract concept of human rights from Europe was clearly one of the issues of contention that brought about Brexit. And I think I have to say, that the way Burke approaches the concept of rights, always linked, as Professor Spada said at the lunchtime address, with the concept of duties, and which comes first, as it were, in our understanding, would suggest a more national control over the understanding of what rights are, especially when they're, of course, applied legally. So, in that respect, I suspect that he would be suspicious about the type of environment and situation in which this discussion is coming up. Takes us back to the issue that morals and character are so. Cicero, again, it's a couple of the real influences on Burke were not Plato, Aristotle, the sort of great philosophical thinkers of Greece. They were Cicero in particular, I believe, anyway, and Sallust. He mentioned Sallust. Mm-hmm. Well, these people are talking about, they're writing the decline of the Roman Republic around them, when issues of what is fitting, what is dignified, which is closely linked to character and how one understands the exercise of virtue. These are actually central. Catiline died a rather glorious death, didn't he? He was very courageous, but he was also sapped and poisoned, or helped to poison the body politic through character faults. So the other question about how do we challenge this authoritarian inclination? I mean, I suppose it goes back to the issue partly. I don't know if this is addressing the question of complexity. First of all, I believe one of the speakers yesterday spoke about, we have got to accept complexity and, really question the way in which we fit most easily and the way in which technology allows us to fit into an ideological mentality and approach. We have to find a space for mystery and the transcendent. Somehow, we have to validate and emphasize the centrality of that for the proper right working of reason as we understand our own natures. Now, that doesn't mean we all have to become Christians, so it doesn't mean we all have to be. It means that we as conservatives in the Burkean tradition must look for aspects of the life of people that we can emphasize links us to something transcendent. It's why it is so disappointing to see how shallow the approach to historical figures and historical events has been now. Trying to sort of wrap up complex historical tragedies or issues or fights in a sort of nice, neat parcel and put it one side or the other. But also things like conservation, the green policy and so on, a new way of trying to encourage citizens to understand the importance of their relationship to the physical environment as something that has preceded them, that they have inherited and that they should pass on. So I think there are various ways in which maybe these aspects of certain courses in schools and universities can be encouraged and promoted, but I don't know if that goes anywhere near sort of your question, but...
All right, thank you. 1 more minute to go. Anyone else wants to join in? Joe, just wrap up and conclude very quickly.
Yes. Well, I'm not familiar with the debate in the UK about the court on human rights, but I'm familiar with courts, and I'm familiar with European courts. And, they have sometimes a very legislatory interpretation of the law, if I may use this, I don't know if it's a barbarism or a neologism. So I assume that a more national-based tradition and then the rule of law in England might be a safer path for a country that has decided to go a different way. And I say that with particular grief because as an Atlanticist, we miss the UK inside the EU. This said, and as Professor Ian Crow spoke about conservationism, I strongly recommend Green Philosophy by Roger Scruton, who is an excellent book about it. And a different approach to environmentalism in a non-fanatical, monochromatic way that is impinged or imposed on us nowadays, and that has left threatens to leave little margin to political speech. And I think both Burke and Scruton would be worried about a thing that is happening nowadays, that it's a power shift to the unelected at different levels, that it's happening as we speak. So there are, for instance, academics advocating that local councils elected, not elected, chosen in a lottery may have precedence over politicians. And these kinds of experiences have been tried in ancient Greece and ancient Rome for certain political positions, and they weren't that perfect. So I think one of the things that people who are worried about authoritarianism should be aware of is that, as Rodrigo said, authoritarianism does not happen just outside our borders. And there are things that should be addressed and should be discussed and should be matured more than just empty slogans or all-encompassing buzzwords that nowadays seem to be absolute truths, and that puts us sometimes in places we don't even knew we were in. And with this positive thought, a skeptical, conservative note, I shut myself down.
All right, time to conclude. Thank you all. I think we had a wonderful panel and discussion, so thank you again. And I hope everyone learned as much as I did, so that's a good thing. Bye-bye and see you at dinner. Thank you.